Let me lay out something for you, something that might just flip everything you thought you knew about Christianity on its head. Imagine for a minute there's a gospel out there, a sacred text, packed with direct teachings from Jesus you've never once heard in any church, any sermon, not even Sunday school. Picture it. This gospel spills deep secrets about our divine nature, how to hit spiritual enlightenment, and truths that have been deliberately buried for damn near 2,000 years. This gospel? It's real, and it's called the Gospel of Thomas. Now, before you go thinking this is just some wild fantasy or another internet conspiracy theory, let me stop you right there. This isn't some made-up story by a modern writer chasing clicks or a quick buck. The Gospel of Thomas is a legitimate archaeological document, unearthed back in 1945 in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, tucked away with a whole library of Gnostic texts that had been buried for centuries. This gospel holds 114 sayings attributed directly to Jesus, and a lot of them are so profound, so groundbreaking, they'll make you wonder why they never came up in any service you've ever attended. Ever wonder why there are so many different Christian denominations out there? Why every church seems to have its own take on the same scriptures? Why some core concepts of early Christianity seem to have completely vanished from modern practice? The answer just might be hidden in texts like the Gospel of Thomas, which show us a version of early Christianity that's wildly different from what we know today. In this gospel, Jesus isn't just the sacrificial figure we know from the canonical Gospels. Here, Jesus is a wisdom teacher, schooling his disciples on how to tap into the divinity already within them. Instead of talking about salvation through sacrifice, he's talking about awakening through knowledge. Instead of pushing dependence on religious institutions, he's championing a personal, internal quest for divine truth. One of the most jaw-dropping sayings in the Gospel of Thomas is when Jesus declares, "If those who lead you say, 'See, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. But rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you." This teaching suggests the divine kingdom isn't some physical spot we go after we die, but a state of consciousness we can hit right here, right now. So the natural question that pops up is, if this text holds such profound, direct teachings from Jesus, why isn't it in the Bible we all know? Why have you never heard a peep about it until now? The answer drags us into one of the most controversial periods in Christian history, those first few centuries after Jesus' death, when different Christian factions were duking it out to define what constituted the true Christian faith. For the first 3 centuries of Christianity, there wasn't just one flavor of Christian thought. You had those who'd eventually become the Orthodox Church, sure, but then there were the Gnostics, the Ebionites, the Marcionites, and a whole bunch of other groups, each with their own scriptures, their own practices, and their own interpretations of Jesus' teachings. Gnostic Christianity, which the Gospel of Thomas belongs to, really hammered home the idea of direct, personal knowledge of the divine, the belief that every person could hit spiritual enlightenment without any institutional middlemen. But here's the kicker. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century and then converted himself, he needed a unified version of the faith, something that could serve as the empire's official religion. That led to the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, where they laid down the groundwork for what we now call Orthodox Christianity. In that process, a ton of texts and teachings that didn't jibe with the official vision got declared heretical and systematically wiped out. The Gospel of Thomas, along with a slew of other Gnostic texts, was one of those that didn't make it through this official canonization process. Not because it was any less authentic or older than the Gospels that did get into the Bible, but because its teachings didn't line up with the hierarchical, doctrinal structure the institutional church was building. A gospel that taught every person could access divinity directly just didn't serve the interests of an institution that was positioning itself as the sole valid intermediary between humanity and God. But the story of the Gospel of Thomas's suppression and other similar texts didn't wrap up in the 4th century. Over the centuries, the institutional church kept actively working to make sure these alternative teachings stayed hidden. When references to these texts occasionally popped up in writings from the church fathers, it was usually to condemn them and warn against them, never actually quoting their real contents so regular folks could size them up for themselves. This suppression campaign was so effective that for over 1,500 years, The Gospel of Thomas existed only as rumor and fragment. Scholars knew it had existed because they'd find references to it in ancient texts, but the full text was considered lost to history. Until 1945, when an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali stumbled upon a ceramic jar buried near the village of Nag Hammadi, holding 13 papyrus codices that included the complete text of the Gospel of Thomas, along with a host of other Gnostic texts. This discovery forever changed our understanding of early Christianity and blew the lid off the magnitude of what had been kept under wraps for so many centuries. The Egyptian farmer had no clue he'd stumbled onto one of the most significant archaeological finds of the 20th century, a treasure that had been buried since around 400 AD, likely hidden by monks from the nearby Pachomian monastery to protect it from destruction ordered by the ecclesiastical authorities. The Gospel of Thomas that emerged from those Egyptian desert sands was unlike anything we knew about Jesus' teachings. It wasn't a narrative of his life, death, and resurrection like the canonical Gospels, but a collection of 114 sayings or logia, many of which kicked off with the words, "Jesus said." These sayings presented a radically different take on spirituality, one that emphasized the internal quest for divine knowledge and direct personal transformation. Some of these teachings felt familiar, versions of parables that also popped up in the canonical Gospels, but many others were brand new and unveiled aspects of Jesus' teachings that had never been preserved in the official tradition. What really ruffled the feathers of traditional religious scholars was that many of these sayings seemed authentic, carrying the same wisdom and spiritual authority that characterized Jesus' most recognized teachings. Some specialists started arguing that certain passages in the Gospel of Thomas might even be older than their canonical Gospel counterparts, representing more primitive versions of the original teachings. This possibility sparked deep discomfort in certain religious circles, because it implied that for over 1,500 years, humanity had been deprived of spiritual teachings of incalculable value. The specific content of these lost teachings was what really explained why they'd been suppressed with such vigor. The Gospel of Thomas presented a version of Christianity that was fundamentally different from what had become official orthodoxy. Instead of hammering home the need for salvation through Jesus' death and resurrection, these sayings zeroed in on the possibility of each person discovering their own divine nature. Instead of pushing dependence on religious intermediaries, they taught methods of direct, personal spiritual seeking. One of the most revolutionary sayings declared that the kingdom of heaven was spread out upon the earth, but people just didn't see it. This teaching suggested that divine experience wasn't something to be put off until after death, but something that could be realized right here, right now by anyone willing to develop the necessary spiritual perception. Another equally radical teaching asserted that when people came to know themselves completely, they'd realize they were children of the living Father, suggesting a direct, intimate relationship with the divine that didn't require institutional mediation. These ideas weren't just abstract theological concepts. They had deep, practical implications for how people related to religion and spiritual authority. If every individual had direct access to divine experience, then the hierarchical structures of the institutional church became, at best, optional, and at worst, roadblocks to genuine spiritual development. If the kingdom of heaven was already present and available for those with eyes to see, then promises of future salvation conditioned on adherence to specific doctrines lost a lot of their controlling power. Look, if this kind of intel gets your gears turning and you want to keep digging into these hidden mysteries of early Christianity, then stick around. I'm always peeling back layers on truths that have been buried for centuries, and your interest helps keep this vital investigation going. But the revolutionary teachings in the Gospel of Thomas went even further than just these concepts of direct access to the divine. Some of the most provocative claims suggested that the distinction between human and divine was far less clear-cut than official theology had taught. One particularly controversial saying declared that those who drank from Jesus' mouth would become like him, and he himself would become like them. This teaching implied a mutual transformation between teacher and disciple, a fusion of consciousness that was radically different from the traditional hierarchical relationship between inaccessible divinity and sinful humanity. These ideas had precedence in the oldest spiritual traditions of the Middle East, where the concept of theosis, or deification, had been central to many mystic schools. The notion that human beings could participate directly in the divine nature not just as a future hope, but as a present possibility, had been a hallmark of many spiritual traditions before institutional Christianity laid down its official doctrines. The Gospel of Thomas seemed to preserve these older teachings, connecting Jesus' words with spiritual currents that stretched way back in history. The suppression of these teachings wasn't simply a matter of abstract theological differences. It was a practical necessity for an institution that was building its authority on the premise of being the sole valid path to salvation. A spirituality that emphasized direct experience and personal transformation couldn't easily coexist with a system that relied on spiritual dependence and institutional submission. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas represented an existential threat to the model of Christianity that would eventually become dominant, not because they were false or inauthentic, but precisely because they might be too true, too empowering, too liberating. Historical evidence suggests that during the early centuries of Christianity, these different spiritual currents had coexisted and competed for the loyalty of believers. Gnostic communities that valued texts like the Gospel of Thomas didn't see themselves as heretical or misguided, but rather as preservers of Jesus' most authentic and profound teachings. Many of their spiritual leaders were just as learned and dedicated as anyone in the communities that would eventually become Orthodox, and their spiritual practices were often more rigorous and transformative than those that developed in institutional Christianity. The question of historical authenticity had been one of the most potent weapons in the theological battles of the early centuries. Opponents of Gnosticism argued that texts like the Gospel of Thomas were late inventions, lacking the apostolic authority that validated the canonical Gospels. However, modern research has peeled back the layers to reveal a much more complex reality. Comparative studies of language, style, and content suggest that many of the traditions preserved in these Gnostic texts might have roots just as old, if not older, than some of the material eventually included in the canonical New Testament. The process of determining which texts were authentic and which were bogus had been deeply political from the get-go. The criteria used to gauge the legitimacy of early Christian texts had been heavily influenced by the power struggles within the expanding Christian communities. A text could be rejected not because it was historically dubious, but because its teachings threatened the emerging consensus on doctrine and authority. Similarly, a text could be accepted not just for its antiquity or authenticity, but because it bolstered the theological positions of the factions gaining traction in the developing ecclesiastical structure. This reality had created a selective filter through which only certain types of Christian teachings had survived into the mainstream, while others had been marginalized or completely suppressed. The Gospel of Thomas had survived this selection process precisely because it had been preserved by communities operating outside the direct control of the emerging ecclesiastical hierarchy. The Coptic monks who had buried these texts near Nag Hammadi in the 4th century had apparently recognized their spiritual and historical value, even as official authorities condemned them as heretical. Their decision to preserve these documents for future generations suggests a deep understanding that what was at stake was more than abstract theological disputes. It was the preservation of entire dimensions of early Christian tradition that might otherwise be lost forever. The implications of this preservation stretched far beyond specialized academic circles. If the teachings contained in the Gospel of Thomas truly preserved authentic aspects of Jesus' original message that had been filtered out or suppressed in the canonical tradition, then millions of people for nearly 2 millennia had been deprived of access to entire dimensions of their spiritual heritage. The tragedy wasn't simply that these texts had been hidden, but that the spiritual traditions they had nurtured had been systematically uprooted, leaving a void in the collective understanding of what early Christianity had truly offered as possibilities for human transformation. Modern resistance to seriously considering these alternative traditions mirrored the patterns that had operated in early Christianity. Established institutional interests, both religious and academic, had a lot to lose if it were acknowledged that the history of early Christianity had been far more diverse and complex than official narratives had suggested. Admitting that texts like the Gospel of Thomas might contain authentic teachings from Jesus would require a fundamental reevaluation of assumptions about authority, tradition, and spiritual truth that had been central to Christian institutions for nearly 2,000 years. Yet the evidence kept stacking up from multiple academic directions. Linguistic studies revealed that some of the formulations in the Gospel of Thomas preserved Aramaic constructions that suggested very early oral transmission, Comparative research showed surprising parallels with Jewish wisdom traditions that had been contemporary with the historical Jesus. Analyses of teaching patterns revealed pedagogical methodologies that were consistent with what was known about first-century spiritual teachers in Palestine. Each of these lines of evidence, considered individually, might have alternative explanations, but their convergence built an accumulating case that was getting harder and harder to ignore. Beyond the questions of historical authenticity, the very content of the Gospel of Thomas offered spiritual perspectives that resonated deeply with modern seekers who'd found institutional forms of religion inadequate for their deeper spiritual needs. The teachings on direct knowledge, personal transformation, and immediate access to the divine spoke to a generation that had been raised in traditions emphasizing institutional mediation and external authority. For many, discovering that these more direct, experiential approaches to spirituality might have roots in Jesus' own earliest teachings had been profoundly liberating and validating. This contemporary resonance had contributed both to renewed interest in Gnostic texts and to ongoing resistance to their acceptance in more traditional circles. Critics argued that the modern popularity of these texts reflected more the projections of contemporary spirituality than any genuine historical understanding of their original meaning. From this perspective, modern readers were finding in the Gospel of Thomas what they wanted to find, interpreting its enigmatic teachings through the lens of their own spiritual quests, instead of doing the harder work of understanding them within their original historical context. Now, that criticism had valid points, but it also revealed problematic assumptions about the nature of spiritual understanding and trans-historical relevance. If the teachings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas truly pointed toward fundamental truths about human nature and spiritual reality, then their ability to speak across centuries could be evidence of their authenticity rather than against it. Great wisdom traditions have always maintained their vitality precisely because their core insights transcend the limitations of any particular historical period, speaking to universal human needs and possibilities that manifest differently in different eras, but retain their essential relevance. The historical suppression of these traditions had consequences that stretched far and wide, impacting the spiritual landscape for millennia. Their implications stretched far beyond the confines of specialized religious history. The sidelining of experimental and mystical pathways to spirituality had cultivated a religious culture that consistently put doctrinal conformity above personal transformation, institutional authority above direct experience, and correct belief above lived practice. These trends hadn't just shaped the evolution of Christianity, they'd also deeply influenced broader cultural attitudes toward authority, knowledge, and the very nature of truth itself. The fallout from these historical decisions had become starkly visible in what many scholars now recognized as a profound crisis of authority within institutional Christianity. For centuries, established churches had drawn their legitimacy from claims of exclusive ownership of divine truth and privileged access to the mysteries of salvation. Yet the rediscovery of texts like the Gospel of Thomas had peeled back the curtain, revealing that these claims rested on historical foundations far shakier than most believers had been led to believe. The teachings preserved in these ancient manuscripts suggested that the earliest forms of following Jesus had been far more diverse, experiential, and centered on personal transformation than later Orthodox traditions ever let on. This revelation had ripped open fundamental questions about the very bedrock of religious authority in traditions that had built their identity around assertions of historical continuity and apostolic fidelity. Defenders of traditional interpretations had met these challenges in a variety of ways, some more convincing than others. Some adopted purely defensive strategies, arguing that Gnostic texts were late corruptions of authentic Christian teachings, not legitimate alternative traditions. From this viewpoint, the historical suppression of these texts was justified precisely because they represented heretical deviations from the true faith. However, this approach had run into significant trouble as archaeological and historical evidence continued to pile up. Increasingly earlier dates proposed for some of these texts, coupled with evidence of their widespread circulation in early Christian communities, made it progressively harder to simply dismiss these traditions as late aberrations or foreign influences. Other proponents of Orthodox perspectives took a more sophisticated route, acknowledging the historical diversity of early Christianity, while contending that the canonization process represented a legitimate distillation of core, enduring elements of Jesus' teachings. From this angle, the fact that certain traditions prevailed over others didn't necessarily signal arbitrary suppression, but rather a gradual recognition by Christian communities of which texts and teachings best captured the heart of Jesus' message. This approach had the advantage of sidestepping historically unsustainable claims about early uniformity, while still leaving room for theological evaluations of the relative fidelity of different traditions. Still, it faced its own hurdles, particularly in explaining why the selection process had been so heavily influenced by political and social considerations rather than purely spiritual or theological ones. The sway of political factors in shaping Christian orthodoxy was particularly evident in the events surrounding Emperor Constantine's conversion and the subsequent institutionalization of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. Historical research revealed how the demands of political unity and social control played significant roles in determining which versions of Christianity received official support and which faced active persecution. The Council of Nicaea and other imperial synods were as much political events as they were theological, with decisions on Christian doctrine influenced by concerns for imperial stability and social cohesion as much as by purely religious arguments. This realization raised uncomfortable questions about the extent to which later Orthodox traditions faithfully preserved Jesus' original teachings versus how much they had been molded by the necessity of accommodating existing power structures. The Gospel of Thomas had been a particular thorn in the side of these official narratives because it preserved teachings that seemed to resist precisely the kind of institutionalization and hierarchical control that characterized the development of imperial Christianity. Its emphasis on direct knowledge, personal spiritual authority, and immediate transformation offered alternatives to religious models built on institutional mediation and doctrinal conformity. For ecclesiastical leaders who needed to build and maintain complex organizational structures, these teachings presented fundamental challenges, both practical and theological. The suppression of such perspectives was, in this sense, as much a strategic decision as a theological one, designed to preserve forms of religious authority compatible with the demands of institutional administration and social control. Yet, the consequences of these decisions reached far beyond mere organizational concerns. The marginalization of mystical and experiential traditions within Christianity contributed to what many observers identified as a broader spiritual impoverishment, a loss of dimensions of religious experience that had been central to earlier wisdom traditions. The approaches to spirituality preserved in texts like the Gospel of Thomas emphasized the possibility of direct personal transformation and immediate access to transpersonal dimensions of reality. Suppressing these perspectives left many later Christian traditions with inadequate resources to address the deeper dimensions of the human spiritual quest, relying instead on belief systems and practices that, while valuable in their own right, often failed to nurture the capacities for direct experience that earlier teachings seem to have systematically cultivated. This loss had implications that stretched beyond the realm of personal religious experience into broader questions of human development and social potential. Wisdom traditions that emphasized personal transformation and the expansion of consciousness had historically served as vital resources for navigating individual and collective crises. By marginalizing these dimensions of experience, dominant religious traditions had deprived themselves of tools that might have been especially relevant for addressing the challenges of increasingly complex and interconnected societies. The recovery of texts like the Gospel of Thomas offered opportunities to reconnect with these lost resources, but it also raised tough questions about how to integrate ancient perspectives with contemporary understandings and modern needs. The rediscovery of these lost texts sparked not only academic interest, but also a fundamental reevaluation of what had been possible within earlier spiritual traditions. Recent research began to reveal that the approaches represented in the Gospel of Thomas were not aberrations or heretical deviations, but expressions of currents deeply integrated into early Christian communities. These perspectives offered frameworks for understanding spiritual experience that differed significantly from the models that eventually became dominant, yet seemed equally sophisticated and systematic on their own terms. The text preserved teachings suggesting approaches to personal transformation based on principles of direct internal development, rather than reliance on external authorities or complex doctrinal systems. These approaches emphasized individuals' capacity to directly access dimensions of understanding that transcended ordinary limitations of perspective and experience. The pedagogical approaches evident in the Gospel of Thomas showed characteristics that strongly resonated with wisdom traditions that had flourished in diverse cultural contexts throughout human history. The teaching techniques employed seemed designed to catalyze direct insights rather than transmit conceptual information, utilizing paradoxes, provocative metaphors, and seemingly contradictory statements to destabilize habitual patterns of thought and perception. This approach was consistent with methodologies found in contemplative traditions that recognized certain types of understanding couldn't be communicated through conventional instruction, but required forms of direct experiential activation. The text preserved examples of these techniques, demonstrating a level of pedagogical sophistication, suggesting systematic development within communities deeply committed to processes of personal transformation and consciousness expansion. Particularly significant were the ways the Gospel of Thomas addressed questions of personal identity and relationship to transpersonal dimensions of reality. The preserved teachings suggested understandings of human nature that transcended conventional dichotomies between material and spiritual, individual and universal, temporal and eternal. These perspectives offered frameworks for understanding human experience as participation in broader cosmic transformation processes, where personal development was seen not as an isolated individual project, but as a contribution to a wider collective evolution. The approaches represented recognized dimensions of experience that connected personal transformation with social responsibility, suggesting that authentic spiritual development necessarily involved active engagement with the challenges and opportunities of the broader social world. These insights had profound implications for contemporary understandings of human development and social potential. The crises characterizing modern societies included not only technical and economic challenges, but also more fundamental crises of meaning, purpose, and connection. Wisdom traditions represented in texts like the Gospel of Thomas offered resources for addressing these deeper dimensions of social crisis, providing frameworks for understanding human development as an integrated process that included spiritual growth, psychological maturity, and social responsibility as interconnected aspects of a more comprehensive transformation. The marginalization of these perspectives contributed to fragmentations that characterized modern approaches to education, personal development, and social change, where different dimensions of human growth were treated as separate domains rather than integrated aspects of a holistic process. The recovery of these teachings began to influence not only religious studies but also fields like psychology, education, and consciousness studies. Researchers started to recognize that the traditions represented in the Gospel of Thomas preserved understandings of human development, remarkably sophisticated in their recognition of latent capacities that could be cultivated through systematic practice and appropriate guidance. These understandings included recognition of states of consciousness that transcended ordinary limitations of perception and identity, capacities for direct intuitive insight that could complement conceptual knowledge, and potentials for forms of empathic connection that transcended conventional barriers between individuals and groups. The marginalization of these perspectives within dominant religious traditions contributed to a broader impoverishment of resources available for addressing contemporary crises that required precisely the types of creative innovation and personal transformation these traditions systematically cultivated. The implications of these discoveries extended into fundamental questions about the nature of spiritual authority and religious legitimacy. The Gospel of Thomas preserved teachings suggesting that access to deeper dimensions of spiritual understanding didn't depend on institutional mediation or conformity with specific doctrinal systems, but on the development of internal capacities potentially available to all individuals. This perspective challenged models of religious authority that relied on institutional control over access to spiritual resources, suggesting instead more democratic and participatory approaches to spiritual development. For institutions that had built their authority on claims of exclusive mediation between individuals and transpersonal dimensions, these teachings represented fundamental threats, both practical and theological. However, the teachings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas didn't promote simplistic individualism or a rejection of community and tradition. Instead, they suggested understandings of spiritual development that recognized both personal autonomy and social interdependence as essential aspects of authentic growth. The approaches represented emphasized that authentic personal transformation necessarily involved developing capacities for deeper connection with others and with broader dimensions of reality, suggesting that genuine spiritual growth was inherently social and relational in its orientation. These perspectives offered alternatives both to extremely hierarchical models of religious authority and to forms of spiritual individualism that denied the importance of community and tradition for sustainable personal development. Integrating these rediscovered understandings with contemporary needs and opportunities required careful navigation of tensions between preserving ancient insights and adapting to modern contexts. Challenges included not only issues of textual interpretation, but also broader questions about how wisdom traditions could be revitalized without being distorted by contemporary projections or specific cultural needs. The temptation existed both to romanticize ancient perspectives and to dismiss them as irrelevant to modern conditions, when what was needed was a more nuanced engagement that recognized both continuities and discontinuities between ancient and contemporary contexts. This integration process required developing new forms of dialogue between traditions that honored the integrity of historical perspectives, while also allowing for creative evolution and adaptation appropriate for contemporary circumstances. The convergence of these rediscovered traditions with contemporary movements revealed fascinating patterns of resonance that transcended temporal and cultural barriers. Researchers observed that many of the practices and understandings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas found surprising echoes in modern developments within seemingly unrelated fields like neuroscience, transpersonal psychology, and quantum physics. Recent studies suggested that states of consciousness described in these ancient traditions corresponded to specific neurological patterns that modern science began to map and understand, providing empirical validation for experiences previously relegated to the realm of the purely speculative or religious. Neuroplasticity specialists documented how meditative practices similar to those implicit in Thomas's teachings produced measurable changes in brain structure, particularly in areas associated with self-awareness, emotional regulation, and the perception of interconnectedness. These discoveries provided scientific bases for understanding why ancient traditions consistently emphasized that authentic personal transformation required not only conceptual shifts, but also modifications in fundamental modes of perception and information processing. The implication was that the teachings preserved in texts like the Gospel of Thomas didn't simply represent abstract philosophies, but precise technologies for developing human capacities that contemporary research began to validate experimentally. In parallel, developments in quantum physics and systems theory provided new conceptual frameworks for understanding claims found in these traditions about the interconnected nature of reality. Concepts like quantum entanglement and emergent properties of complex systems offered scientific analogies for experiences of unity and interconnectivity central to the teachings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas. While these parallels didn't constitute direct proof of the literal validity of specific claims, they suggested that fundamental intuitions about the nature of reality preserved in these traditions were consistent with emerging scientific understandings of the universe's operating principles at both microscopic and macroscopic levels. However, this convergence between ancient wisdom and contemporary knowledge required careful interpretation to avoid simplistic reductionisms that threatened to distort both traditional insights and scientific discoveries. The challenge was to recognize genuine resonances without forcing artificial correspondences or using scientific validation to legitimize aspects of ancient traditions that operated in entirely different domains of empirical investigation. The most promising approaches recognized that wisdom traditions and scientific inquiry represented complementary methodologies for exploring different aspects of human experience, each with its own distinctive strengths and limitations. This integration of perspectives provided new opportunities for addressing contemporary challenges that required both intellectual rigor and a depth of understanding transcending purely analytical approaches. Crises, the challenges related to environmental sustainability, social cohesion, and psychological well-being, had necessitated forms of personal and collective transformation that strongly resonated with emphases found in the Gospel of Thomas regarding the development of capacities for clearer perception and more compassionate action. The preserved teachings suggested that these challenges required not only technical solutions, but also a fundamental evolution in modes of consciousness that shaped how individuals and societies related to their environments and to each other. The process of recovering and applying these insights also revealed deep-seated resistances operating at both individual and institutional levels. Many individuals found that authentic engagement with the perspectives represented in the Gospel of Thomas demanded questioning not only specific beliefs, but also fundamental assumptions about the nature of identity, purpose, and relationship that were deeply embedded in dominant cultural structures. This process of deconstruction and reconstruction was frequently challenging and disorienting, particularly for individuals whose sense of security and purpose had depended on adherence to conventional belief systems. At the institutional level, the integration of these perspectives met resistance from organizations whose authority relied on maintaining monopolies over the interpretation of spiritual traditions or the distribution of related resources. The implication that access to deeper dimensions of understanding did not necessitate specific institutional mediation threatened not only established power structures, but also economic models dependent on controlling access to spiritual resources. Nevertheless, some progressive institutions began to explore how these rediscovered perspectives could revitalize their own traditions and expand their capacity to serve authentic contemporary needs. The emergence of communities of practice that integrated insights from the Gospel of Thomas with contemporary methodologies provided living laboratories for exploring practical applications of these teachings. These groups experimented with forms of social organization and decision-making that reflected principles of collective wisdom development and distributed leadership implicit in the preserved traditions. The results were mixed but frequently promising, suggesting that the approaches represented offered valuable resources for developing more participatory and sustainable forms of human organization. Translating ancient insights into contemporary contexts, however, demanded careful discrimination between elements representing universal principles and those specific to particular historical conditions. Not all aspects of these traditions were appropriate for direct adoption into modern contexts, and the temptation existed for both uncritical idealization and premature dismissal of perspectives that required creative adaptation rather than literal replication. The most successful approaches recognized that preserving the essence of these teachings required allowing for evolution in their forms of expression and application. The cumulative impact of these rediscoveries began to catalyze broader shifts in how contemporary societies approached fundamental questions concerning education, healthcare, governance, and economic development. Principles of holistic development, participatory decision-making, and long-term sustainability, central to the traditions preserved in the Gospel of Thomas, started to influence developments across multiple sectors of society. While these shifts were gradual and often controversial, they represented movements toward more integrated and humane forms of social organization that acknowledged both material needs and spiritual aspirations as legitimate aspects of human well-being. The emergent synthesis suggested that the Gospel of Thomas and similar traditions preserved not merely historical curiosities, but vital resources for navigating contemporary transitions toward more mature and sustainable forms of human civilization. These traditions offered maps for types of personal and collective transformation necessary to address challenges threatening humanity's survival and flourishing. However, accessing these resources demanded a willingness to question dominant assumptions and embark on growth processes requiring both intellectual courage and sustained practical commitment. The history of the Gospel of Thomas demonstrated that the suppression of alternative perspectives had consequences resonating across centuries, limiting the range of options available for addressing fundamental human challenges. Yet, the survival and rediscovery of these traditions also demonstrated the resilience of authentic insights and their capacity to re-emerge when conditions were ripe for their reception. This pattern suggested that genuine knowledge possessed self-preserving qualities that transcended efforts to permanently suppress it. The implication was that resources for navigating contemporary challenges were potentially available, but accessing them required a willingness to look beyond dominant and institutionally sanctioned sources of information. Ultimately, the legacy of the Gospel of Thomas resided not in specific dogmas or rigid practices, but in its demonstration that possibilities for human understanding and transformation were vaster than dominant systems had typically acknowledged. The preserved teachings pointed toward latent capacities for clearer perception, deeper compassion, and more effective action, potentially available for development by any individual willing to undertake the necessary work. This perspective offered both hope and responsibility, suggesting that humanity's future depended not on external intervention, but on a collective willingness to actualize potentials inherent in the human condition from the outset. The Gospel of Thomas preserved reminders of these possibilities, inviting each generation to rediscover and realize these capacities in ways appropriate for their own unique time and circumstances.